The lesson topic for this video is solving polynomial equations. Now, this lesson is actually going to be a kind of combination between the work you've done on factoring and work on solving using the zero product property. So here's our first example, y equals 3x squared minus 10x plus 4. Now this is actually quadratic, which is still a polynomial, but we've actually already worked on this. So it's a good example to get us started. First of all, remember, anytime we ask you to find y when we know what x is, you may use your graphing calculator and use trace. So let's go ahead and put y equals 3x squared minus 10x plus 4 into our graphing calculator and then trace and find out what y is when x is 5. And what you should come up with is y equals 29. Okay, but when we ask you to find x when we know what y is, we are going to have to show that work algebraically. So, first thing we're going to do is we're going to put 12 in for y into our equation. And I suggest that you always write this out as to not make mistakes when you are solving, getting the equation equal to 0, I should say. So our first step is to take a look at the equation. This is a quadratic in standard form because we have an x squared and an x term. So we know we need to make sure that it equals 0 on one side. So to do so, I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides of my equation, right? And put that over here because it's a like term with a 4 since they're both constants. And then we have 12 minus 12 is 0 equals 3x squared minus 10x minus 8, because 4 minus 12. Now we have a quadratic equation, and we are going to solve this either by factoring or the quadratic formula. Now I'm going to focus on all factoring in this unit, so we want to factor this. I'm going to come off to the side and I'm going to write my magic term or magic number. This is also called the AC method in some classrooms. So negative 24 x squared is what we get when we multiply our a term by our c term. Okay, so negative 24x squared. And we're going to find our factors that multiply to give me negative 24x squared, but when we add them, it gives us negative 10x. Now again, to do this, whatever way you use is fine. I typically will think about how we need, for example, here's one option, right? Negative 1x times 24x, or maybe negative 2x times 12x, and then there's negative 3x times 8x, and there's negative 4x times 6x. So all of these multiply to give me negative 24x squared. Now we need to find out which of them, and we can move that negative around if we need to the other term, which one of them adds up to negative 10x. Well, you'll probably notice that if we switch this to a positive right here, and we switch the 12 to a negative, we're going to get negative 10x when we add those two together. So that's what we need to use. So what we're going to do is I'm going to rewrite this, I'm going to move it over a little bit. 0 equals 3x squared, and I'm going to leave some space right here. I'm going to leave some space. And then minus 8, the third term goes here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take the negative 10x and we're going to break it into two terms. And the two terms we're going to use are the ones we just found over here. So we've got positive 2x minus 12x. And now, using this process, we're going to put that vertical line down between the first two terms and the last two terms. And then we're going to factor the GCF of each side of that line. So I'm going to leave this 0 equals here, and I know that I'm going to factor out just an x on this side, and I'm going to be left with 3x plus 2, factoring out GCF of x. And over here we're going to factor out a GCF of negative 4, and we're going to have left 3x plus 2 when we factor out that negative 4. This is good because our parentheses match 3x plus 2 and 3x plus 2. So now we're going to just rewrite 0 equals, and I'm going to write that matching term, 3x plus 2, and then I'm going to write what is left after factoring that out. So if you'll notice right here, this term, before the subtraction sign, we factored this out, so we're left with an x. And then over here in this term, after the minus sign, or including it, I should say, we factored this out, we're left with minus 4. So minus 4. Now, in the last chapter, we were done once we factored this part right here into these two factors. But now we're not done because we are solving. We are trying to find the value of x. We have not done so yet. So if you look right here, we have what is called the zero product property. You will probably remember that from a previous lesson. If we multiply two things together and we get 0, we know that one of the two things must equal 0. So be careful, because in a previous unit we always just said, oh, it's going to be -2 and +4. That is not the case right here because of this 3. So I'm going to rewrite the zero product property statement. So we have 3x plus 2, the first parentheses factor, equals 0. And I have x minus 4 equals 0. One of those two things must equal 0. So now on this side we're going to subtract 2 from both sides. And we get 3x equals -2. And now be careful when we divide both sides by 3. I'm out of space here a little bit, but if we divide this side by 3 and we divide this side by 3, we're going to end up with x equals -2/3. Okay, and on this side over here, we're going to add 4 to both sides, and we're going to get x equals 4. And those are our two solutions. Okay, now let's try this next example. Again, we have y equals 5x to the 4th minus 45x squared plus 3. We have a polynomial equation, and we want to find y when x is 2. Same thing, anytime we know what x is, we already know what x is, we're going to use trace on our graphing calculator. So ask if you have questions on that, but we're going to put this equation into our graphing calculator for y1, and then we're going to trace and find y when x is -2. When we do that, we're going to find that y equals -217, and you can check that and make sure you are doing those steps correctly. Now, this next example, find x, when y equals 3. First thing we're going to do is we want to make sure to put that 3 in for y. And if I were you again, I would rewrite this entire equation out clearly. All right. And again, when we have a polynomial with different x terms, we're going to need to make this equal to 0 before we can solve. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. And when we do so, we're going to get 3 minus 3 is 0, equals 5x to the 4th. Minus 45x squared, and notice we have a positive 3 minus 3, that actually becomes 0 as well. Now, I'm just realizing, shame on me on that previous example, on the first example we did today. I did not, at the original, at the beginning of the problem, remind you to always look for a GCF before you solve. So I should have done that, and we're going to do that on this example. Now, we have a 5 at the coefficient here and 45 here. We know they're both divisible by 5, so we can factor out a 5. And if we have x to the 4th and x squared, we can factor out x squared. So we're going to start by factoring out our GCF. We're going to leave the 0 equals here, don't forget that. And we're going to write a 5 and an x squared. And we're going to then say what's left in our parentheses after we factor that out. All right. So if I have 5x to the 4th and I factor out 5x to the 2nd, I am left with x squared minus, if I had 45x squared and I factored a 5 out, I'm left with a 9 here, and I factored out x squared, so no more x's here. Now, we need to factor what's in the parentheses if we're able, and we are able to factor what's in parentheses because this is a difference of 2 squares. So we will rewrite this again, 0 equals 5x squared, and we have two sets of parentheses here. We know that x times x gives us the x squared here. And we know that 3 times 3 will give us the 9 as long as one is positive and one is negative. It'll give us a negative 9. Now, this is completely factored. At this point, we can use the zero product property to solve and find x, right? Find x when we know what y is. All right, so what we have to remember here is when we use the zero product property, we do indeed have to say that any of these things can be equal to 0, including the 5x squared. Okay, so 5x squared can equal 0, x plus 3 can equal 0, and x minus 3 can equal 0. And we're going to solve each of these. The first one, to solve for x, we would divide both sides by 5. Now, 0 divided by 5 is 0, so we're left with x squared equals 0. And now if we have x squared, to solve this we need to square root both sides. And when we square root both sides, we end up with x equals the square root of 0, which is 0. Anytime you factor out anything with an x variable, you will get x equals 0 as one of your possible solutions. All right, the next two, we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. And when we do that, we're going to get x equals negative 3. And then we're going to add 3 to both sides on this one. And we're going to end up with x equals 3 as another possible solution. So our solutions, when y is 3, x can be 0, negative 3, and 3. All right, here is one more example, and it is in function notation. Remember that another name for f of x is y, and so if I'm trying to find f of negative 1, that is what our x value is. And if we're trying to find x and we know what f of x is, again, that's when we know what y is and we're trying to find x. Go ahead and try these examples on your own and then check back to see how you did. Okay, so for the first example, f of negative 1 should equal 0. And as you see, I've started the second one just for saving a little bit of time. I put a 0 in for y, and then I'm going to remind you that the first thing we want to do is look for a GCF. And the GCF in this example is 2x. When we factor that out, we are left with the following. So we have 0 equals 2x times x squared plus 4x plus 3. And now I'm going to factor this without using magic number or the AC method, because anytime this number is 1, the coefficient of x squared is 1, the quickest way to factor is just by putting your parentheses down and finding the values you need in each parenthesis. So I'm going to put an x here and here, because x times x is x squared. And now I need to know what number, what two numbers when multiplied gives me 3, that when I add them gives me 4. And that will, of course, be positive 1 and positive 3. Again, if we were to FOIL this out, we get x squared, which is this, plus 3x plus 1x, which is 4x, and then plus 3. So now we're at the zero product property, and we're going to go ahead and say that either 2x equals 0, or x plus 1 equals 0, or x plus 3 equals 0. Solving each of these, we're going to divide both sides by 2 because it's 2x, not 2 plus x. So x equals 0. And we're going to subtract 1 for this one. We're going to subtract 3 on this one. So for here, we've got x equals negative 1. And this equation, we've got x equals negative 3.